Welcome to our very first episode of Loredive, where we look into the lore of various video games to analyze and explain aspects of their story. Today we will be doing the first of several episodes looking into the game Dead by Daylight, an asymmetrical horror game where one killer must hunt down and kill up to 4 survivors. In time, we will get to all of the survivors and killers in the game, but for our first episode, we want to start with the core that holds this realm together, and that would be none other than the presence known only as the Entity. Not much is known about the supernatural being known as the Entity, but what we do know is that it is responsible for bringing the various survivors and killers together, and creating the playing field for the killers to hunt. After being ensnared by the Entity, a man by the name of Benedict Baker began documenting everything he could about the creature, and left behind his journals that further explain what he believes the creature to be. In his eyes, the Entity is an evil and malevolent creature that exists between reality and imagination. The Entity does not eat in the way that most beings do, and instead must feed on hope and despair. It has created a setting in order to make an endless loop where it can feed off of the struggles between killers and the survivors to provide itself endless sustenance. The Entity pulls these beings into its world, reaching out into various realities, unburdened by time and touching those who are weak to its influence. The first beings that it most likely captured were those who were susceptible to performing horrible acts of violence. And if Baker's journals are correct, the Entity may have influenced some of these terrifying murders to begin with. After folding these killers into its realm, it then imposes its own will upon them. It is believed that some of these murderers were more than willing to hunt down nameless survivors without end, while others had to be coerced. The prey for these hunters would be the uncorrupted, the survivors. These otherwise normal people are pulled into the Entity's realm for one purpose only: to produce the fuel for it. It isn't entirely known how the Entity chooses its victims, as who is pulled into the realm varies, but almost all are either lost or nearing death when the Entity claims them. The survivors have no memory of how they end up in the realm of the Entity, but all who are ensnared awaken by the campfire, a temporary haven in this realm of darkness, and from here they are firmly in the being's clutches. After the pawns have been gathered, the Entity summons a realm to place them in a ritual which is known as the Procedural. These realms are locations filled with violence and tragedy, and act as hollow memories that originate from one or multiple beings that the Entity has captured. Once all of the pieces have been set, the game begins. The killers are given one simple goal: find the survivors and put them on twisted versions of meat hooks that litter the realm. From these meat hooks, the Entity will enter the Procedural and pluck the hope and despair that has accrued from the survivors' still living bodies, and feast upon it. After it has fully appeared, however, it will not take the survivor immediately. Instead, it will struggle with the survivor, further drawing out their dread. During this time, if another survivor appears and manages to detach their comrade from their prison, the Entity will retract and allow the escape. If the same survivor is brought back, however, the Entity will immediately grab them and pull them from the realm. Once a survivor is pulled from these hooks, the hook they were on is immediately destroyed. This is true for every hook in the realm but 4. These hooks reside in the same place every time, in an area simply known as the basement. The survivors are given a decidedly different task, as the meat hooks aren't the only things that are scattered around the area. Placed around the Procedural are several generators, and up to 5 must be powered in order to activate 2 large exit gates. Opening these gates will allow the survivors a chance to escape the Procedural, and return to the campfire, where the entire process will begin again. If a survivor fails to escape and is sacrificed, they will still wake up at the campfire, though a little more hollow, and with a little less hope than when they left. It is unknown what happens when a survivor completely loses their hope, but Baker believed that they may become another killer under the control of the entity. The connection between the entity has side effects for both the killers and survivors. The killers are all significantly connected with the entity, all receiving a boost in strength and speed as well as abilities exclusive to each killer, making them forces to be reckoned with. This connection also causes the survivors to see a red stain in front of the killer, giving them an opportunity to see where the killer is and what they are observing. As the killers serve under the entity, they develop the ability to pluck power from it, including unique abilities known as perks. These perks have various effects, and can often change the flow of the procedural. Survivors, on the other hand, have a fairly light connection to the entity, but like the killers, they can also learn to pull power from it in order to assist them in the procedurals. Each killer and survivor has perks unique to them, and over time, both can teach others these perks, allowing for more versatility in the procedurals. Though a force to be reckoned with, the entity is not all-powerful. From time to time, killers may manage to wrest themselves away from the control of the entity temporarily, and occasionally, the entity manages to disconnect from a killer or survivor completely. If the entity loses its connection to a survivor, a hollow shell will remain unable to move or act. If the entity loses connection to its killer, however, it will forcefully stop the procedural in its tracks. There are also aspects of the procedurals that the entity has no control over, such as the hatch that will open only when one survivor remains, as this hatch was neither created nor is controlled by the entity. As we continue this series, we will look into various aspects of the game, and that includes more information about the entity itself. Our next episode will be all about the original 4 survivors and their part in the procedural. If you enjoyed this episode of Loredive, please like and subscribe, and please reach out to us to any other lore videos that you might like to see. We will continue with Dead by Daylight, and add new games to the series as we progress. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.